Take everything I own, just don't hurt her, please.
There is only one thing I want. Your hand in marriage.
She stood shivering in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains, holding a worthless deed and a desperate prayer. The town said the man up there was a beast, more wolf than human. But Abigail had to save her sister, even if it meant selling her soul to a monster. The Montana Territory in the autumn of 1883 was an unforgiving landscape, a place where a man's worth was measured in acreage and ammunition, and a woman's survival depended entirely on her grit. For Abigail Montgomery, grit was the only inheritance her father had left behind. That, and a crushing, insurmountable debt. The dust hadn't even settled on John Montgomery's grave when the riders came. Abigail stood on the rotting wooden porch of their homestead, the wind whipping her dark hair across her face as 6 men rode into the yard. At their center was Jedediah Cross. Cross was a man who owned half the town of Oakhaven and held the deeds to the other half. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored wool suit that looked entirely out of place against the raw frontier, his silver pocket watch catching the pale afternoon sun. "Miss Montgomery," Cross said, his voice as smooth and cold as a river stone, leaning forward in his hand-tooled leather saddle. "A tragedy about your father. A good man. Just poor at mathematics." Abigail swallowed hard, her hand instinctively reaching behind her to press against the trembling shoulder of her 10-year-old sister, Lily. "Mr. Cross, the harvest is weeks away. I told your clerk we would have the first installment by the end of the month." "The terms of the loan were clear, Abigail," Cross replied, casually inspecting his fingernails. "Upon the death of the signatory, the balance of $2,000 becomes immediately due." "You don't have $2,000. You don't even have $2. "Take the farm," Abigail pleaded, stepping forward. "Take the cattle. Take the house. Just let us walk away." Cross chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "This dirt patch? The bank wouldn't give me $50 for this alkaline soil." "No. The contract stipulates that if the property fails to cover the debt, collateral of equal value must be seized to work off the balance." He nodded to his men. "Take the little one." What happened next was a blur of dust, screaming, and sheer brutality. Abigail fought like a wildcat, tearing at the men's faces, kicking the horses, but she was thrown to the dirt by a backhanded strike from one of Cross's heavies, a massive brute named Elias. She tasted blood as she hit the ground. Through ringing ears, she heard Lily shrieking her name as Elias hoisted the child onto the back of his horse like a sack of grain. "When you find $2,000, Miss Montgomery, you can buy back her freedom," Cross said, turning his horse. "Until then, she'll be working in the laundries at my mining camp up north." They need small hands for the machinery. Abigail dragged herself to town, her face bruised, her dress torn. She pleaded with Sheriff Miller, a man whose badge was practically bought and paid for by Cross's cattle money. He merely tipped his hat, mumbled an apology about legal contracts, and closed the jailhouse door in her face. She begged the church. She begged the merchants. Everyone looked away. In Oakhaven, crossing Jedediah Cross was a death sentence. Defeated, she sat in the dark corner of the local saloon, the Rusty Spur, staring at her empty hands. That was when Hank, the grizzled bartender, slid a glass of water toward her and leaned in close. "There ain't a man in this valley who will stand against Cross," Hank muttered, wiping the bar with a dirty rag. "But there is a man who don't live in this valley, up on the ridge." The Devil's Peak. Abigail looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "The mountain man?" "Wyatt Callahan." Hank whispered the name like a curse. "Used to track men for the Pinkertons before the war. They say he went mad. Lives up there in the ice and the pines. Shoots trespassers on sight. They say he took out an entire gang of horse thieves single-handed 3 winters ago. He don't care about Cross's money, and he ain't afraid of the law. If you want a devil to fight a devil, you go find Callahan." Abigail didn't hesitate. She had no money, no weapons, and no hope. But she had a horse, a thin wool coat, and a fire burning in her chest that rivaled the sun. Before dawn broke, she rode out toward the treacherous peaks of the Bitterroots. The ascent was a nightmare of jagged stone and biting frost. By the second day, Abigail's horse, exhausted and terrified of the steep, icy inclines, threw a shoe and refused to move further. Abigail was forced to continue on foot. The wind howled through the ancient pines, sounding like the screams of the damned. Snow began to fall, thick and blinding, wiping out any trace of a trail. Her boots were soaked through, her hands numb, her lips cracked and bleeding. She dragged herself upward, driven solely by the echo of Lily's terrified screams. Just as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, plunging the world into a freezing, suffocating darkness, Abigail heard the low, guttural growl. Through the blowing snow, she saw the yellow eyes. A timber wolf, massive and starving, stepping out from the tree line. Abigail reached for the small, rusty hunting knife in her belt, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the handle. The wolf lunged. A deafening crack shattered the silence of the mountain. The wolf dropped instantly, a heavy lead slug buried in its side. Abigail gasped, falling backward into the snow, her vision swimming. Through the whiteout, a figure emerged. He was monstrously tall, draped in thick bear furs, a smoking Sharps rifle resting easily in one hand. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, looking down at her, as the darkness finally claimed her. When Abigail awoke, the world was blessedly warm. She was lying on a cot covered in heavy, beautifully tanned pelts. The smell of wood smoke, roasting meat, and pine needles filled the air. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim light of a meticulously built log cabin. Sitting by the stone hearth, carving a piece of ash wood with a hunting knife, was the beast of the Bitterroots. Wyatt Callahan was not the scarred, crazed savage the town whispers had painted. He was a man in his late 30s, possessing a rugged, weather-beaten face with a jawline carved from granite. Dark hair, threaded with silver, fell past his ears, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that struck her. They were a piercing, intelligent gray, like the sky before a blizzard. "You're awake." His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that rumbled in his chest. "You're lucky I was tracking that wolf. You'd be bones by morning." Abigail sat up, clutching the furs to her chest. "Mr. Callahan, I came looking for you." He didn't look up from his carving. "People don't come looking for me. They come looking to hide, or they come looking to die. Which are you?" "I came to hire you." Wyatt stopped carving. He slowly turned his head, his gray eyes fixing on her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "I'm not for hire. Go back down the mountain." Abigail threw off the furs, ignoring the aching cold in her joints, and stood up. She walked toward him, her bare feet on the wooden floorboards. "My name is Abigail Montgomery. Jedediah Cross took my 10-year-old sister. He's holding her hostage for a debt my father left behind. He's going to send her to the mining camps." At the name Jedediah Cross, a subtle shift occurred in Wyatt's demeanor. His jaw tightened, and his grip on the knife shifted. "Cross?" Wyatt muttered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "I know you don't care about town politics," Abigail said, her voice rising in desperation, "but I have nothing else. The town won't help. The law won't help. I will give you everything I have. My father's claim. The deed to the land. Once I get it back. I'll work for you. I'll clean your cabin, tend your traps, cook your meals. I will sign my life over to you, Mr. Callahan. Just please, save my sister." Silence stretched between them, heavy and absolute. The fire popped and hissed. Wyatt slowly stood up. He towered over her, casting a long, imposing shadow. "Your land is worthless to me," Wyatt said slowly. "I have thousands of acres up here. Your servitude means nothing. I've survived alone for a decade." Tears finally spilled over Abigail's eyelashes. "Then I have nothing. Why did you even save me?" Wyatt stepped closer, looking down into her tear-streaked, defiant face. "I said I didn't want your land, Miss Montgomery, and I don't want a servant." He paused, his gaze dropping to her trembling hands, then back to her eyes. "But Cross has been trying to run a railroad spur through my valley for 3 years. He's bribing judges in Helena to declare my land abandoned because I have no legal heir and no registered homesteading family. The law says a solitary squatter can be evicted for territorial progress." Abigail frowned, confused. "What does that have to do with me? If I go down that mountain and start killing Cross's men, the territorial governor will have the army up here in a month to hang me, and take my land anyway, Wyatt said, his voice deadly serious. I need an ironclad legal standing in this territory. The Homestead Act protects established families from corporate land seizures. Wyatt reached over to a small wooden table and picked up a piece of charcoal and a worn ledger. I will ride down to Oakhaven. I will tear Cross's operation apart piece by piece, and I will bring your sister back to you, Wyatt stated, his eyes locked onto hers. But in exchange, you don't give me a deed. You don't give me your servitude. Then what? Abigail whispered. You give me your hand, Wyatt said. You marry me, legally, bindingly, before God and the territory. You take my name, you become the matriarch of this land, and you stay here forever. Abigail stared at him, the wind outside howling against the timber walls, feeling as though the floor had suddenly dropped out from beneath her. Marriage? The word tasted foreign. Impossible. You want me to be your wife? We don't even know each other. We know exactly what matters, Wyatt countered coldly, setting the ledger down. I know you are desperate enough to walk into a blizzard for your blood, and you know I am dangerous enough to kill the men holding your sister. Love is a luxury for people in cities, Miss Montgomery. Out here, survival is the only currency that matters. He walked over to a heavy iron lockbox in the corner of the room, flipped the latch, and pulled out a stack of legal documents. Cross has the judge in Oakhaven in his pocket, but there's a circuit magistrate currently snowed in at the halfway station down at Pine Ridge. We ride there, we sign the papers, he stamps them. You become Abigail Callahan. Then, I go to war for you. Abigail's mind raced. To marry a stranger. To live out her days in this frozen isolation. To tie her fate to a man who solved his problems with a rifle. It was a terrifying, permanent surrender. But then she pictured Lily, tiny and frail, coughing in the damp, toxic air of Cross's mining camps. She lifted her chin, wiping the tears from her face, her jaw setting with the same stubborn determination that had carried her up the mountain. If Lily is returned to me safe, and she is allowed to live here with us, protected, I accept. Wyatt studied her for a long moment, a flicker of something perhaps respect crossing his stoic features. Agreed. The next morning, they descended the mountain. Wyatt was a completely different man than the quiet carver by the fire. He was strapped with a bandolier of ammunition, twin Colt revolvers holstered at his hips, and his prized Sharps rifle in a leather scabbard on his massive black warhorse. He had outfitted Abigail with warm clothes, boots that actually fit, and a steady gray mare. They reached the Pine Ridge halfway station by midday. The circuit magistrate, a nervous, sweating man named Harrison, balked at the sight of the heavily armed mountain man. I need a marriage certificate drawn and witnessed, magistrate, Wyatt commanded, slamming a gold eagle coin onto the wooden table of the station. Right now. With shaking hands, the magistrate read the vows. There was no dress, no flowers, no music. There was only the smell of wet wool, cheap coffee, and the cold metal of Wyatt's revolvers. Do you, Abigail Montgomery, take this man? I do, Abigail said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. And do you, Wyatt Callahan? I do. Wyatt signed the ledger, his handwriting surprisingly elegant. Abigail took the pen, her hand trembling just slightly as she signed away her freedom. Abigail Callahan. Wyatt took the stamped paper, folded it carefully, and placed it in his breast pocket. He turned to Abigail, his expression unreadable. Stay behind me from here on out. They rode south toward the valley, the terrain flattening out as they approached the timberline. Cross's compound was a fortified ranch a few miles outside of Oakhaven, but they didn't even make it to the property line. As they navigated a narrow pass flanked by high canyon walls, the crack of a rifle echoed. A bullet skipped off the rock just inches from Wyatt's head. Ambush! Wyatt roared, slapping the hindquarters of Abigail's horse, sending her bolting toward the cover of a massive boulder. 4 riders appeared on the ridge above them. Cross's outriders. They had recognized Abigail from the town and had been waiting for her to return from the mountain. Abigail huddled behind the rock, covering her ears as gunfire erupted. She expected Wyatt to take cover, to hide. Instead, she witnessed the terrifying reality of the man she had just married. Wyatt didn't flinch. He spurred his black horse forward, directly into the line of fire. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, dropping the reins and drawing his Sharps rifle. He fired from the hip a deafening blast. The lead rider on the ridge pitched backward off his horse, dead before he hit the ground. Wyatt holstered the rifle and drew his twin Colts in one smooth motion. The remaining 3 riders opened fire, kicking up dust and rock around him. But Wyatt was relentless. He fired methodically, his face a mask of absolute calm. Bang, bang. A second man slumped over his saddle. A third horse reared, its rider taking a bullet to the shoulder and screaming in agony. The fourth man, realizing the absolute slaughter he had just ridden into, turned his horse to flee. Wyatt spurred his horse, closing the distance with terrifying speed. He didn't shoot. He rode alongside the fleeing man, reached out, and dragged him out of the saddle by the collar of his coat, throwing him violently to the dirt. The gunfire ceased, leaving a ringing silence in the canyon. Abigail cautiously peered around the boulder. 3 men lay dead or dying. The fourth, the brute named Elias, the very man who had dragged Lily away, was on his knees in the dirt, staring up the barrel of Wyatt's smoking Colt. Wyatt looked over his shoulder at Abigail, his eyes burning with a cold, violent fire. Then he looked back down at Elias, pulling the hammer back with a sharp, metallic click. "Where is the girl?" Wyatt asked softly. "You have 10 seconds to tell me before I paint this canyon with your brains." Elias trembled, the cold steel of Wyatt's Colt pressing against his sweat-drenched forehead. The brute, who only a day ago had tossed a child over his saddle like a sack of stolen flour, was now weeping openly into the Montana dust. "She ain't at the camps!" Elias choked out, his eyes darting frantically between Wyatt's unforgiving stare and the bodies of his comrades. Cross didn't send her north. He kept her at the main house. The estate. Down in the root cellar. Abigail stepped forward from the shadow of the boulder, her heart dropping into her stomach. "Why?" He said she was going to the laundries. "Bait," Elias spat out, wiping a mixture of blood and dirt from his chin. "Cross knew you'd come back, Miss Montgomery. He knew you'd try to find the money, or find a gun, or find—" He looked up at the towering mountain man. "Find him. He wanted you to walk right through his front gates so he could dispose of you quietly. He's got Sheriff Miller and 6 deputies drinking his whiskey right now, waiting for you." Wyatt didn't blink. He simply lowered the hammer of the Colt, holstered it, and brought the heavy wooden stock of his Sharps rifle down hard against Elias's temple. The man crumpled into the dirt, unconscious. "Tie him to his horse and send it walking," Wyatt commanded, turning back to his war horse. "We have a schedule to keep." "Wyatt, you heard him," Abigail pleaded, rushing to his side. "It's a trap. Sheriff Miller is there. If you shoot a lawman, even a corrupt one, the Territorial Army will hunt us to the ends of the earth. We'll lose everything." Wyatt paused, his gloved hand resting on the saddle horn. He looked down at her, the harsh lines of his face softening for just a fraction of a second. "I told you I would tear his operation apart piece by piece, Abigail. I don't intend to make you a widow on our wedding day. We aren't going through the front gates." Jedediah Cross's estate was a sprawling, opulent monstrosity of imported red brick and white pillars, built purely to mock the untamed wilderness surrounding it. It sat in the center of the valley, fortified by high wooden fences, and patrolled by men who valued Cross's silver dollars more than their own souls. Under the cover of a pitch-black, moonless night, Wyatt and Abigail approached the rear of the property through a dense thicket of cottonwood trees. The autumn air was biting, but Abigail barely felt the cold. The adrenaline coursing through her veins was a roaring fire. Wyatt moved with a terrifying, absolute silence. He was a shadow detached from the darkness. He instructed Abigail to wait by the tree line, leaving her with one of his heavy revolvers. "If I am not back in 20 minutes, you ride back up the mountain. You barricade the cabin. You do not look back." "I am not leaving without Lily," Abigail whispered fiercely, gripping the heavy gun with both hands. Wyatt met her gaze. "I will bring her to you." He vanished over the wooden palisade. Abigail waited, counting the agonizing seconds. She heard the faint sound of boots on gravel, then a muffled thud, followed by the heavy dragging of dead weight. Wyatt was systematically clearing the rear perimeter. Minutes later, a low whistle sounded from the fence. The gate latch clicked open. Wyatt stood there, motioning her inside. And they moved past the dark, silent shapes of two guards lying unconscious in the grass, heading straight for the slanted wooden doors of the root cellar located at the base of the manor. Wyatt produced a heavy iron pry bar from his coat and jammed it beneath the iron padlock. With a sickening screech of tearing metal, the lock gave way. He pulled the heavy doors open, revealing a stairwell descending into total darkness. "Lily?" Abigail hissed into the gloom. A tiny, terrified gasp echoed from the bottom. "Abby?" Abigail flew down the wooden stairs, her boots slipping on the damp stone. In the dim light filtering from the open doors above, she found her sister huddled in the corner, shivering under a filthy, moth-eaten blanket. "Oh, sweet girl," Abigail sobbed, dropping to her knees and pulling the frail child into her chest. Lily buried her face in Abigail's neck, crying silently, her small hands clutching Abigail's wool coat with desperate strength. "We have to move," Wyatt's deep voice resonated from the top of the stairs. "Now." Abigail picked Lily up, surprised by how light she felt, and hurried up the stairs. But as they crested the top, the terrifying sound of a Winchester rifle racking a shell echoed through the courtyard. Suddenly, the courtyard was flooded with blinding, harsh light, as a dozen kerosene lanterns were unshielded simultaneously. They were surrounded. Standing on the back porch of the estate, dressed in a silk smoking jacket and holding a crystal glass of amber bourbon, was Jedediah Cross. Beside him stood Sheriff Miller, a shotgun resting lazily in the crook of his arm. At least 10 hired guns formed a tightening circle around the cellar doors, their rifles leveled directly at Wyatt's chest. "I must admit, Mr. Callahan," Cross said smoothly, taking a slow sip of his bourbon, "when Elias didn't return, I assumed the whispers about the ghost of the Bitterroots were true. You are a remarkably difficult man to kill, but you are, ultimately, just a man." Wyatt stood in front of Abigail and Lily, a human shield of fur and muscle. He didn't reach for his guns, he just stared at Cross with eyes like chipped ice. "Let the woman and the child walk away, Cross. This is between you and me." Cross threw his head back and laughed, a cruel, echoing sound. "Oh, Wyatt, you truly have been isolated up on that mountain too long. You don't understand the game we are playing. I don't care about you. I don't even care about your pathetic little strip of land for a railroad." Cross stepped off the porch, walking slowly toward them, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You see, Abigail," Cross smiled, his eyes glinting with malice, "your late father, God rest his mathematically challenged soul, wasn't entirely useless. Before he died, he partnered with an old prospector named Dutch Cassidy. They spent weeks up in the high ridges near Devil's Peak, and they found it." Abigail frowned, clutching Lily tighter. "Found what?" "The mother lode," Cross whispered, his voice trembling with greed. "The largest, purest vein of silver this side of the Dakotas. It cuts right through the bedrock of your property, mister. Callahan and bleeds directly into the Montgomery claim." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. "You killed him," Abigail gasped, the horror washing over her. "My father didn't die of a sudden fever. You poisoned him." A harsh word, poisoned, Cross tutted. "I simply expedited his journey to the afterlife before he could file the mineral rights with the territorial office. Once he was gone, I forged the loan documents to seize the Montgomery claim. The only piece of the puzzle left was the Callahan Valley. I needed you both out of the way to legally possess the entire mountain." Cross sighed, looking at the dozen rifles aimed at them. And now, how wonderfully convenient. The reclusive mountain man and the destitute orphan, caught trespassing on my property in the dead of night. Shot dead by the town sheriff while resisting arrest. A tragic end. Sheriff Miller raised his shotgun. "Any last words, Callahan?" Wyatt's face was a mask of cold fury. Slowly, very deliberately, he raised his hands. But he didn't raise them in surrender. He raised them to the collar of his thick bear fur coat. "Just 2. Wyatt rumbled, his voice carrying over the wind. He ripped the coat open. Strapped across Wyatt's chest were 4 massive sticks of mining dynamite, the fuses already burning, hissing violently in the quiet courtyard. He had lit them the moment he heard the rifle rack. "Take cover!" Cross shrieked, dropping his bourbon glass and diving toward the dirt. Panic erupted. The hired guns scrambled backward. dropping their rifles, tripping over each other to escape the blast radius. Sheriff Miller stumbled, his shotgun discharging wildly into the air. In the fraction of a second that the courtyard dissolved into pure chaos, Wyatt spun around. He grabbed Abigail by the waist, hoisting both her and Lily simultaneously, and threw them bodily back down into the reinforced stone stairwell of the root cellar, diving in directly on top of them. The world exploded in fire and thunder. The shockwave tore through the courtyard, shattering every window in the opulent manor. Dust, splinters, and hot shrapnel rained down as the heavy wooden cellar doors above them were blown off their hinges. Ears ringing, half-deafened by the concussive blast, Wyatt was on his feet before the smoke even began to clear. He pulled Abigail up. "Run! To the horses!" They scrambled out of the smoking ruin of the cellar. The courtyard was a scene from hell. 2 of Cross's men were dead, caught in the direct blast. The others were incapacitated, screaming in pain or blindly stumbling through the thick, choking smoke. Cross himself was nowhere to be seen, having crawled beneath the porch. Wyatt drew his twin Colts and laid down a suppressing fire, covering their retreat. "Go! Go!" he roared, blasting a deputy who tried to aim his revolver through the smoke. Abigail dragged Lily through the breached rear gate, finding the horses where they had left them. She hoisted Lily onto the gray mare, leaping into the saddle behind her. Wyatt sprinted toward his black warhorse, but as he vaulted into the saddle, a single shot rang out from the back porch. Cross, his face bleeding and blackened with soot, stood leaning against a shattered pillar, a smoking Winchester in his hand. Wyatt grunted, his body jerking forward as the bullet tore through the fleshy part of his left shoulder. He didn't fall. He spurred the massive black horse, and they tore off into the tree line, leaving the burning estate behind them. "Wyatt, you're hit!" Abigail screamed over the rushing wind, seeing the dark stain spreading rapidly across his coat. "Ride!" he bellowed back, his jaw clamped shut in agony. "They will follow! We have to reach the high pass!" The ride back up the mountain was a desperate, bloody blur. The storm that had been brewing for days finally broke, unleashing a torrential downpour of freezing rain that quickly turned into blinding sleet as they gained elevation. The cold was a blessing in disguise. It slowed Wyatt's bleeding, but his face was deathly pale. By dawn, they reached the narrow, treacherous pass that led to Devil's Peak. It was a sheer cliff face on one side, a deadly drop into a rocky gorge on the other. Far below, echoing up the canyon, they heard the howling of hounds and the sharp crack of rifle fire. Cross had rallied his remaining men and was coming for their heads. "We make our stand here," Wyatt rasped, sliding off his horse. His left arm hung uselessly at his side. He pulled his Sharps rifle from its scabbard with his right hand. "You can't fight them all, Wyatt," Abigail cried, sliding off her mare and rushing to his side, her hands pressing against his bleeding shoulder. "You're losing too much blood." Wyatt looked down at her, his cold gray eyes softening with an emotion she had never seen before. He reached up with his good hand, his rough, calloused fingers gently brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. "I told you I would protect you, Abigail," he said softly. "You are my wife. This is my mountain. They don't belong here." He turned away, limping toward a massive outcropping of rock that overlooked the narrow pass below. He wedged the heavy barrel of the Sharps rifle into a crevice, stabilizing it. "Take Lily. Go to the cabin. Lock the heavy door. Do not come out until I call for you," he commanded, never taking his eyes off the trail below. "No," Abigail said. The word hung in the freezing air. Wyatt looked back, shocked. Abigail walked to his black horse, reaching into the saddlebag. She pulled out the heavy Colt revolver he had given her at the estate. She marched back to the rock outcropping, her boots crunching in the fresh snow, and knelt beside him, resting the barrel of the pistol on the stone. "I signed the paper, Wyatt," she said, her voice trembling, but her eyes burning with an undeniable fire. "I am the matriarch of this land, and I protect what is mine." For a long moment, the mountain man simply stared at the fiercely brave woman beside him. A slow, genuine smile, the first she had ever seen, broke across his weathered face. Then aim low. The wind carries the lead up here. 10 minutes later, the posse appeared. Cross rode at the center, flanked by 5 heavily armed men. They were forced into a single file line to navigate the treacherous, icy pass. "Hold!" Wyatt whispered, his eye pressed to the iron sights of his rifle. "Wait until they hit the ice sheet!" When the lead rider stepped onto the slickest part of the trail, Wyatt squeezed the trigger. The thunderous boom of the Sharp's rifle echoed off the canyon walls like a cannon shot. The lead rider was thrown from his horse, plummeting over the edge of the cliff into the gorge below. The posse panicked. The horses screamed, slipping on the ice. Abigail opened fire with the heavy Colt, her shots wild but terrifying, kicking up ice and stone around the riders. "Up there!" Cross screamed, pointing his Winchester. "Kill them!" A volley of bullets chipped the rock face above Abigail and Wyatt. Wyatt fired again, methodically reloading with one hand. Another rider fell. But Cross was cunning. He realized they were sitting ducks on the trail. He dismounted, diving behind a fallen pine tree, and signaled his remaining 3 men to fan out and scale the rocks to flank them. "They're moving up the sides," Wyatt gritted his teeth, struggling to hold the heavy rifle with his fading strength. "Wyatt, look!" Abigail pointed up. High above them, near the jagged summit of Devil's Peak, a massive shelf of snow and ice clung precariously to the rock face, heavy and unstable from the fresh blizzard. Wyatt understood instantly. It was a desperate gamble. If he missed, they were dead. If he hit it, they might all die anyway. He shifted his aim away from Cross, pointing the barrel of the Sharp's rifle almost vertically toward the summit. "Cover your ears, Abigail. Press yourself into the rock," Wyatt commanded. He took a deep breath, steadying his trembling, blood-soaked arm. He exhaled and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck the exact center of the ice shelf. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a sharp, terrifying crack echoed across the valley, louder than the gunfire. It started as a low rumble, a vibration that shook the very bone beneath their feet. Then, the mountain roared. A massive tidal wave of white fury detached from the summit, thousands of tons of snow, ice, and boulder hurtling down the canyon at terrifying speed. Cross looked up, his eyes widening in absolute horror. He turned to run, but there was nowhere to go. "Hold on!" Wyatt yelled, throwing his massive body over Abigail, shielding her entirely beneath his heavy fur coat as they pressed into the crevice of the rock outcropping. The avalanche hit the pass like a freight train. The sound was deafening, a physical force that crushed the breath from their lungs. The world went blinding white, violently shaking as the fury of the mountains scoured the trail clean. And then, just as suddenly, there was a deafening silence. Abigail choked on a lungful of snow powder, coughing violently as Wyatt slowly lifted his weight off her. The rock outcropping had acted like a wedge, splitting the avalanche around them. They were buried in a foot of snow, but they were alive. Wyatt dragged himself up, peering over the rock. The trail was gone. The pass was gone. Cross, his men, and his horses had simply been erased from the face of the earth, swept down into the bottomless gorge. The mountain had reclaimed its own. Abigail let out a sobbing gasp of relief, throwing her arms around Wyatt's neck. He groaned in pain from his shoulder, but he wrapped his good arm around her waist, pulling her tightly against his chest, burying his face in her dark hair. They sat there in the snow, the beast of the Bitterroots and the girl from Oakhaven, holding each other as the morning sun broke through the storm clouds, bathing the frozen peaks in golden light. A month later, the first heavy snows of winter had permanently sealed off the valley from the world below. Inside the warm, fire-lit cabin, the smell of roasting venison and pine filled the air. Lily sat by the hearth, her cheeks full of color and life, happily carving a piece of ash wood with a small blunt knife Wyatt had made for her. Abigail sat at the heavy oak table, carefully reviewing the official deed to the Montgomery Callahan claim. The magistrate and Helena had honored the marriage certificate, legally binding the 2 massive tracts of land together. The silver vein was theirs. Cross's empire in Oakhaven had collapsed in his absence, the corrupt sheriff running for the border before the territorial marshals arrived to investigate the explosion. Wyatt walked up behind her, his left arm finally out of its sling, though still stiff. He placed his hands on her shoulders, leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss against her temple. "Does it look legally binding to you, Mrs. Callahan?" His deep voice rumbled playfully. Abigail smiled, reaching up to cover his calloused hand with hers, her thumb brushing against the simple silver band he had forged for her from a nugget they found in the creek. "Ironclad," she whispered, leaning back into his embrace. She had climbed the mountain looking for a monster to save her family. Instead, she had found a fiercely protective husband, a fortune beneath the earth, and a love that was as wild, enduring, and unyielding as the Montana frontier itself. If you were captivated by this gritty tale of frontier justice, survival, and unexpected romance in the unforgiving Montana territory, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who love Wild West dramas and thrilling historical romances. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our epic, real-life inspired audio stories. Drop a comment below on what era we should explore next.
Hi, my name is Royal Trials, the owner and manager of Royal Trials. After watching the video, she offered the mountain man everything to save her little sister. He only wanted her hand in marriage. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the feeling of devotion and sacrifice. At the heart of this story is someone willing to do whatever she can for a person she loves. And that kind of determination makes the emotional journey especially meaningful. It also raises interesting questions about trust, intentions, and the choices people make when they are under pressure. Do you think she made the right decision given her circumstances? And how did you feel about the mountain man's proposal as the story unfolded? I'd love to hear what you thought about their relationship and how it developed over time. One lesson I take from stories like this is that difficult situations often reveal what matters most to us. In everyday life, taking time to understand someone's motivations can help us see them with more compassion and patience. Thanks for spending time with Royal Trials today. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these Mountain Man romance stories, a like or subscription is always appreciated.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, she offered the mountain man everything to save her little sister. He only wanted her hand in. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, the strongest feeling in this story is devotion. The kind that comes from caring deeply about family and being willing to make sacrifices for the people you love. It's also a reminder that genuine character often matters more than wealth, status, or what someone can offer in return. Do you think you would have made the same choice if you were in the mountain man's position? And what part of the story spoke to you the most? Sometimes the best lessons come from asking ourselves what we truly value when faced with difficult decisions. One small way to apply that lesson in everyday life is to take a moment to show appreciation for the people who stand by you when times are hard. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these Mountain Man tales, consider liking the video or subscribing to Rugged Heart Man for more stories from the frontier.